It's The Law Show on CL 650. A comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law.
Help! I need somebody. Help! Not just anybody. Help! You know I need someone.
Yes, and welcome to The Law Show on CL 650. I'm Zach Spencer, and today we're focusing on personal injury. And joining us in studio are two experts, Scott Stanley and Kevin Gourlay at Murphy Battista LLP in downtown Vancouver. And the boss is away this time. You guys are in. Where's Joe?
I hope he's not golfing. It's raining today.
Okay.
Could be raining.
All right. So thanks, both of you gentlemen, for coming on. And we want to talk about brain injuries and concussions specifically. Do you see that a lot in your practice about personal injury, car accidents, things like that? Is concussion a common theme?
It is in my practice. About 50% of my cases are people that have concussions or people that have had them and are either better from them or getting better from them. So it's quite common in my practice. And
is that a result of a car wreck?
Yeah, most often it's the result of a car accident, usually a rear-end accident or a high-velocity accident, but they can happen in sporting events, people falling, striking their heads, all manner of ways that people can sustain a concussion.
Now, Kevin, this is sort of front-page stuff now. I mean, concussions where you would go and you would say, oh, you've had a concussion and just get on with your life. Now there's protocols around it, especially with sports. Kids, my kids play flag football, but mom doesn't want them to play tackle football because of this whole issue. So where have we gone in the last 10 years? How far have we come around the awareness of concussions?
Well, I think there's been a lot of development there. It used to be when we were all kids, it was you had your bell rung, you dusted yourself off, and you got back on the field. And it's only in recent years that people have realized that you're really putting yourself at significant risk because when you've had a concussion, what you need is to be able to rest your mind, rest your brain so that it can recover, and you're certainly more susceptible to further injury in the period after that.
So if you have somebody that's been rear-ended in a car accident and they've been diagnosed with a concussion, do they typically recover after time, or what percentage in your practice do you see have long-term effects of this?
Well, I mean, our practice is skewed because we only see the people that don't get better, but the literature says that about 90% of people that have had a concussion will go on to make a full recovery. And so that's the data. But what we see is we see the 10%, and our job is to convince a judge or a jury that what they're seeing is not actually a 90% skew of the population. It's actually the 10% that don't get better.
So how do you know you have a long-term problem? Because when you've had a concussion or you've had some traumatic brain injury, you don't remember your old self. So how do you find that out? Because you've changed and you might not realize the issue you have.
It's fun. Go ahead, Kevin. Yeah.
Oftentimes, we find that out by speaking to the people around them, your family members, your loved ones. Those are the people that notice the changes more than the individual. If you break your leg, you're the best person to talk about
absolutely
about what you're feeling and what you're going through. But oftentimes with a concussion, you might feel foggy and you might have headache symptoms and you might not realize that you're forgetting your keys more often. But oftentimes it's the people around you that really notice the changes most.
One of the common symptoms of a concussion is they don't have insight. And so they don't realize they're different, but it's a comment that's made from a spouse. They'll say, this isn't the man I married. This is a completely different person. I have a stranger in my bedroom. I've got a stranger in my home. And it's not until that information is brought forward and brought to the victim's attention that they realize, wait a minute, there's something different here.
Because what you're often seeing are very subtle changes. And
I was going to ask you, what are the telltale signs?
Well, the telltale signs often are things like headache, changes in cognition, changes in memory, focus, concentration, things like that. But those same symptoms can be seen for all sorts of reasons. They can be seen because of pain, because of medications you're taking. So it can be very difficult to determine whether or not what you are actually suffering from is a result of a concussion or a traumatic brain injury or from something else. And oftentimes it's only with passage of time that you're able to diagnose that.
Is there a diagnosis for concussion? Like, is there a clinical way to actually say, yes, that's absolutely what happened?
Well, there's a lot of controversy. There's actually not what I would call medical consensus about what criteria should be used to diagnose a concussion. There's about 5 consensus statements given by different organizations at different times that you use to diagnose a concussion. But for the most part, they're similar. You have to have, at the time of the insult, you have to have either loss of consciousness or a interruption in your cognition in some fashion. You need to have an exhibition of symptoms within a certain period of time afterwards. And there has to be no other explanation for it, like a stroke or medication or drug use, to explain the interruption in cognition. And so it's a fairly low threshold to diagnose a concussion. And so that's where the controversy, some doctors say, well, it's far too low. We're telling people that have concussions when they don't. That's not good medical practice. So it's still a work in progress.
And I guess the problem also is, depending on your age, as you get older, people will say, well, it's something other than a concussion. But when it's a young person that's 20 years old, and as you mentioned, they've had their bell rung, and it's quite obvious that there's no other factors. They're a perfectly normal, healthy individual other than the fact they've just had their bell rung. Mm-hmm. That's going to be much more obvious than someone who's on blood pressure medication, is maybe overweight, all of these different things that they could say, well, that could be the issue, right?
If you get a hit in a football game and you're lying on the field unconscious, there's no question at that point that you've had a concussion. It might be that a week from now you're 100% better and able to get back on the field, but that's clear that you've had a concussion. Mm-hmm. More controversial is the person who gets up from a hit and is dizzy, is not maybe entirely sure where they are or what's going on, and has to look around before they can get back into the game, but do stay in the game. And those people oftentimes still have had a concussion. And we don't know, there isn't much diagnostic significance, meaning you don't know what the long-term effect is going to be just from the initial impact.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. There's this gray area about where are we going to be 20 years from now with this issue.
Well, we've come a long ways in 10 years. I mean, where are we now? We now have the President of the United States saying, if I had a son, I wouldn't let him play football. Mm-hmm. So I think we're well aware of the concussion risk.
I have my wife saying that.
Exactly.
I don't need to go to the President.
Exactly. But you listen to the President. Got to listen to Obama for now.
Not Trump. But anyway, so in personal injury, you have people come in, often rear-ended, and you have those soft tissue injuries, whiplash, right, which affects your neck. And your neck can be out. I know this because I have an issue with my neck. I go and see a massage therapist, a chiropractor regularly. And if it's out, I have those sort of wonky feelings, feeling a little bit hazy. So how do you define between whether, in your world, whether it's just a whiplash problem or a real concussion? You get doctors involved, obviously.
Well, we rely on the doctors, but I mean, you get different results from different doctors and different generation of doctors. Like, it used to be, the thinking was at one time that you cannot have a concussion unless you sustained a blow to your head, and that's nonsense. I was cross-examining this neurologist who got his training in 1957, mm-hmm. and
so really up to date.
Well, I'm sure he still had leeches on the shelf. And so I was in front of a jury, and he said there was no concussion. It was a very violent rear-end collision. This guy's head shook violently, and he said there can't be a brain injury unless you strike your head. And I said, so if I take my then 6-month-old nephew and I just take him and I shake him, that won't produce a brain injury? And he just paused and he said no. And then the jury just
went silent. Yeah.
Well, they went silent because they couldn't believe what he said. So
because we all know there's the shaking baby syndrome, which is
common
which
sense.
Is the brain hitting the inside of the head, right?
Yeah.
And that's what a concussion is the brain impacting the skull, isn't it?
Yeah.
Kevin, yeah. Oftentimes, in the rear end context, there's the forces of the going forward and then back again. There's the coup and the contra coup forces, where it's really the brain that is a soft substance inside the skull impacting the skull because of the energy that's being transferred from the impact. And it's the impact of the brain against the skull that causes that injury.
Yeah, and that's where you get football. Mm-hmm. The helmet's hit, and then the brain keeps moving forward, right? And that's where you have the issue.
Well, you look at Junior Seau. I think if there's any football fans out there, he played 20 years for the San Diego, and then he played in New England 20 years. He was a physical specimen, never once diagnosed with a concussion. But after he stopped playing, exhibiting signs of post-concussion syndrome, and eventually took his life, and they autopsied his brain, and it was just lousy with brain disease, CTE.
Mm-hmm. What does CTE mean?
Chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So he clearly had a bunch of microconcussions that were never diagnosed.
Well, if you're playing 20 years and you're in a full contact sport like football, where often your head is getting the brunt of it. Sure, your skull is intact because you're wearing a helmet, but everything inside is getting knocked around. And that's the problem.
Yeah, and what's concerning in a football context is that they're more and more seeing that what Scott just referred to as microconcussions, or what they sometimes call subconcussive forces not strong enough to produce what we would define as a concussion, that those are putting people at increased risk in the long term, and that's why you're seeing more and more news coverage of these retired football players struggling.
Now, when we were kids, we would fall off our bikes or skateboards or scooters or whatever, and we'd crack our head often before their parents yelled that you got to wear a helmet. But we've all cracked our head at some point or another. But that's not the real issue here. It's the constant in sports, these micro events that are mini injuries that cause this long-term problem, right? Yes, and you know, we all have to live our lives, and you're going to have some bumps along the road. With the football, I think people are getting bigger and people are getting faster, and the hits are more high energy than they ever were before. Mm-hmm. But the physiology of the brain isn't changing, so it's not getting bigger and stronger to absorb these increased forces. Well, the best way to describe it is if you ever watch on television, they have the hockey games from 20, 30 years ago. They play these old games, and you see how slow, Wayne Gretzky and Mark Messier really were in the 80s compared to how fast the kids are today. Well, the rink hasn't changed in size, and these guys are hitting each other on the hockey rink much faster. Like it's a totally different sport than it was 30 years ago. There was a memo I saw a while ago. I think it was might have been the Vancouver Millionaires, when saying that players are expected to report to camp on such and such date and are supposed to meet these basic physical requirements. And I believe it was 20 push-ups. And I could even do that. And 30 sit-ups and things like that. So I think times have changed a little bit, yeah. Yeah, I used to go to training camp to get in shape. Yeah. Now these guys are going hard at it all year round. All right, we're talking about concussions and brain injuries, and our guests today are Scott Stanley and Kevin Gourlay from Murphy Battista LLP, and we're talking on The Law Show right here on CL 650, and we'll continue our conversation next.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.